Mickey noted the Georgia Tech upset earlier when he was doing his coverage of the Pick'em this week. That also netted the Yellow Jackets the FWA's National Team of the Week, Cheese National Team of the Week award. So that a big win for them. And with that, we'll bring on Ben Portnoy. He's our media guest for the week. He's from Sports Business Journal. He's a voter on the FWAA committee. He's used to be a beat writer for South Carolina with the state. And I'll keep biding for time until I see his face pop up. But Ben, there you are. Hey, good morning. It's great to see you.
Sorry about that.
You are good. Wonderful to see you this morning. Thank you for joining us. As an FWAA voter, how excited do you feel each week to vote on the team and play of the week? Because I certainly get a kick out of sending the ballot out.
No, it's fun. And, to be honest, like when you're following along on Saturdays, it's honestly a good way to catch up on some stuff that you might not see or miss during the course of the day when you're trying to keep up with all the games going on. So I'll be honest, it's an instructive effort, I would say sometimes.
So as we look ahead, as much as we want to choose it National Team of the Week to be the big news of yesterday, certainly the biggest news of yesterday was the latest playoff bracket coming out, or I should say the latest CFP rankings and the playoff bracket dictated by those rankings. But I put a look at that on the screen here. I want to just kind of jump right into it. When you first saw the rankings come out yesterday and saw kind of how it laid out in bracket form, what was the big thing that jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think to me, the biggest things that have jumped out, at least early, and we saw this a little bit last week, was kind of where were BYU and Indiana going to be slotted. I think to me, those were kind of the two most interesting teams in the sense of the resumes. BYU's less so, Indiana's for sure. A little bit thinner, at least. And obviously, like strength of conference and for as it relates to BYU. Both those schools ended up in sort of okay spots. I guess BYU was number 9 last week. I think Indiana was 7, if I'm not mistaken, or 8. Moved up both, at least on the not necessarily in the seed lines, but in the actual rankings. BYU up to 6, Indiana up to 5. I think that feels more reflective of where those schools are at the moment. I think those definitely stood out. I think the fact that Notre Dame continues to be in the mix bodes well for the Irish. I think that, it's certainly a little suspect that I think that a lot of people are choosing to ignore a loss to a kind of middle of the pack MAC team, but that's the benefit of the doubt you get at Notre Dame, and obviously they're beating the heck out of a lot of people right now. So I think those were kind of the 3 sort of big things that I thought I at least gravitated toward in this last batch.
Yeah, when you look at those teams, Indiana and BYU that you mentioned are probably arguably the 2 most surprising. I don't know if anybody was necessarily surprised to see Oregon at 10-0 right now, but nobody really expected to see BYU and Indiana on this bracket going into the season. What do you expect either or both of them to hold strong as strong as it started, I should say?
Yeah, this is probably a good time to say that I'm actually an Indiana grad, so I can certainly say that no one in Bloomington thought that Indiana would be 10-0, for sure. I think that, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think BYU's got a little bit of this team of destiny thing going on right now. Have played some really, really tight games. I think, others, and I'm certainly not the first to make the parallel to TCU a couple of years ago, where get by the skin of their teeth a bunch of times and certainly have a little bit of that feel with the Cougars right now. Indiana's a little bit different. I think that, Indiana's in an interesting spot in that, the schedule's certainly been soft, but they're they've only won one of those 10 games by less than 2 touchdowns. I mean, I think their average margin of victory is up around 27, 28 points, give or take. This is a program that is like beating the hell out of people. And I think that that's the thing that stands out. And I think the committee reflects that, right? Like that's why they're sitting at number 5 right now when you don't really necessarily have a marquee win. Now they play Ohio State in 2 weeks. I think this is good. That's going to be the game that everyone circles. If Indiana goes in and loses, 53-7, then I think that pretty much does that. But I do think that, if Indiana holds close in that game, I think they're probably still, certainly not a lock, but I do think it gets really interesting if you end up with, say, a 1-loss Indiana team at 11-1, and you're matching that or comparing resumes with a bunch of 10-2 SEC teams. I think that gets really compelling really quickly. And I think that, not to say it's a Florida State situation necessarily, but I do think it is an interesting dynamic that the committee is going to have to sift through.
I didn't realize as I teed you up for that you're an Indiana guy. I should have known off the top of my head. If I can take a quick detour on that point, we had scouts who hit the road on behalf of FCS. Are there any Bloomington recommendations or things you're like, oh, if you're going to go to a game in Indiana, you got to make sure you do this while you're there?
Definitely, Upland Brewery is the go-to spot. That was my favorite spot in undergrad, and still is probably one of my favorite spots. Upland Brewery and the Tap. Those are my two favorite Bloomington spots.
There you go. So I know where I'm stopping first and second when I finally make it to Bloomington. I think one of the other, you look at the, the thing that jumped out at me at least as a representative of the Citrus Bowl is Georgia being the first team out in this scenario. And the possibility that maybe they won't make this 12 team playoff race. It's still a lot of football to play, but you know, do you think that they end up being out when this is all said and done?
I think it's an interesting dynamic at play. I mean, obviously Georgia's got to win out. I think, starting with this week against Tennessee, I think that's a big piece of it. If they get through that game, I think it's probably safe to say that they're on the table. I think they got Georgia Tech left after that. Probably a trickier game than they thought it might be on paper, at least at the beginning of the season. But certainly that's a big game looming. I, I think, look, like despite what the criteria might say, I think there is still some level of schools get a little bit of the benefit of the doubt for recent history. And I think it's hard to ignore no matter who you are, whether you're a voter or not. Right? Like Texas is probably a good example, right? Texas pretty much doesn't have a quality win yet this season. The one game they played against, someone with, not to say with a pulse necessarily, but the one team they played that really gave them a run for their money was Georgia, and they lost by 2 touchdowns pretty handily in Austin. So I think that, but you look at that again and say, hey, Texas was, a play away from making the national championship a year ago. I think there's a little bit of recency bias, and I think Georgia certainly probably deserves the benefit of the doubt in that case, and has played one of the hardest schedules in the country this year. When you add all those things up, I think there's reason to see why people feel so highly about Georgia. But then you look right down the line, and SMU is the same, is a sort of interesting dynamic as play as well, right? Like SMU's the top of the ACC right now, undefeated in conference, and they're sitting there at 14, and with an only loss coming to number 6 BYU. So I think there's a little bit of a funny game going on here of like, where do you stick these teams? And Georgia and SMU, I think, are certainly in the middle of that discussion.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see where your eventual ACC champion winds up. I think it certainly jumps out at people just by nature of how the bracket is constructed. That number 9 Miami is a gets a bye by the nature of being projected conference winner. But I think there's still a lot to be said in the ACC before that's all said and done. I wanted to also ask you about a team not featured here, but a team you know well, the South Carolina Gamecocks. We were talking a lot about Jack State, but earlier this year you would have never had South Carolina Vanderbilt circled as a huge game in the SEC or a huge game for either team, but it turned out to play out that way, and it was an impressive win for South Carolina, especially given the wins that Vandy had earlier this year against some of their top competition. Are you a believer in those Gamecocks? And do you think, they made an appearance? I think they were 21 in the poll yesterday. What should we expect from South Carolina from here on out?
Yeah, South Carolina's a really interesting team right now. And I think there's a lot of people that haven't played it, don't necessarily pay close attention to that program. Now, I live in Columbia and used to cover the team, so I'm a little closer to it than most. But I think that, I mean, that team's basically 3 plays away from having one loss right now and being smack dab in the middle of this playoff mix. I mean, they sort of kicked away a game against LSU, quite literally missing a field goal at the last second, no pun intended. But, had a game that their quarterback got hurt, couldn't hold on against LSU, lost to Alabama by, I think, 2 or 3 points, in Tuscaloosa in a game that, frankly, like South Carolina probably should have gutted out. This is a really good football team. And I think their defensive line is crazy good. They wreak havoc. I mean, I'm not telling, most people anything they don't know, but I truly believe this is probably one of the 3 or 4 best defensive lines in the country. Like, I don't think that's a stretch. And I think they're so, so, so good on that front that it creates so many problems for opposing offenses. Like, this defense is elite, and I think it's kept them in a lot of games. And I think that, they've got a quarterback in Lenoris Sellers who's young. He's a redshirt freshman, but he's sort of growing as the season goes on. Like, certainly it hasn't always looked pretty, and the numbers probably don't bear it out necessarily, but like the eye test type thing, like he's got some talent and some real talent and some real game breaker ability. And Rocket Sanders at running back too, was a first team all SEC guy at Arkansas 2 years ago. Like, we're not that far removed from Rocket being one of the best running backs in the SEC. And I think as you've seen Lenoris grow, as you've seen Rocket get going, the offense has picked up some of the slack to marry with a really, really good defense. Like, that South Carolina team, like, I don't know. I don't think it's crazy to say there's a world that team ends up winning 9 games this year, sitting at 6-3 right now. I mean, I know they've got games against Missouri this week at home. They've got Clemson still. They've got Wofford sandwiched in between, but I don't think it's totally crazy to say that South Carolina ends up winning all of those games. Like this is a really, really good football team, and I think it's probably one of the most talented teams that Shane Beamer's had in his now what 4 years at South Carolina. I don't think that's a stretch.
Yeah, and certainly a 9-win team would put them squarely in the Citrus Bowl discussion, if nothing else. Which would be, I think coming out of the start to the season, you wouldn't have necessarily been projecting that, but really since that Alabama close call, it's been all systems go. I'm interested to talk to you a little bit broadly about the all of the playoff talk, and ultimately you're a sports business reporter now. You work with SBJ, and that's a lot of your beat. I imagine it's been an interesting season to be covering sports business in general because of it seems like every week is a new story. What has been kind of the most interesting storyline, and there's some of the most interesting storylines for you as a sports business reporter, as it relates to the college football and college football playoff this season.
Yeah, if I didn't get a law degree, but increasingly I feel like I should have. I think that, you look at just the general landscape. I think, one of the things that I think has been really interesting to follow has been just the advent of the 12-team playoff. And I think sort of what does it look like? How much more, I guess maybe involved is the right word, our fans as the season goes along and things like that, how our network responding to it. Um, I think generally speaking, right, like this is a this is a product that was certainly a little bit unknown. There was a lot of talk about like, is it going to downplay the regular season? Is it going to, create, take away from some of the fun of college football? Like ultimately the 12-team playoff has been a great thing, I think. I mean, I think you've got what 25 teams right now that are or 20 teams probably that feel like they have at least some outside shot at a college football playoff berth, right? Like at this point in the season, a year ago, we're probably talking about 6 teams or 7 teams. And I think like that's generally good for the larger health of college football. I think more broad strokes. I think a lot of athletic departments and college football specifically have a lot of questions about the House settlement and what that might mean for college sports. I think athletic departments are looking at how do we pay our football players while also paying our basketball players, while also paying our, star women's basketball players or women's soccer players or whatever, like on down the line. And I think that that's a really pressing issue for a lot of administrators right now. And I think that, football is definitely going to be the bell cow in terms of how money's divvied up, I think, if and when the settlement does go through. But I do think like that's a big stressor for administrators right now and trying to sort through that.
Yeah, I'm also curious as it relates to the playoff and the kind of the home teams hosting in the first round as opposed to them being at bowl sites, that kind of thing. What is your take on the business of that, and do you expect that to continue to? I guess we'll see how it plays out in these first year or two with the home sites hosting, but I'm curious your take on that in general.
Yeah, look, I think it's great. I think that I think there's a really nice way to marry these two things, and I think that ultimately, like if you look toward 2026, when there's a look-in provision for the college football playoff where they could theoretically expand it or change the format or things like that, I think there's a world that I don't think it's far-fetched to say, hey, if the playoff goes to 16 teams and you put the first 2 rounds at on campus and you put the final couple of rounds at bowl sites, like I think that makes a ton of sense for pretty much everyone involved. I think that like the home game atmosphere, what it's going to bring, the way that fans are going to react to it, like I think it's going to be a big deal, and I think that people are going to go crazy for it. And I think certainly there's logistics around it, and I get it. Like you know State College, Pennsylvania is notoriously not the easiest place to get to, and hotels are at a premium. But again, like the flip side of that is like these schools put on major football games every other Saturday in the fall. Like, yeah, it's a bigger scope and scale, and you got a different logo on it. But I do think that like these schools are capable of doing a lot of these things. So I think it'll be interesting. I think certainly logistically there is going to be some challenges, and I think schools are still working through that right now. I think they're trying to get out ahead of it. Certainly there's the option for schools to move it to a neutral site if they so desire. I think no school desires to do that. I think most schools are going to want to have an on-campus game if they can. So again, I think there's a marriage to be made here between the bowl system and between the schools of like, okay, if we can get some games on campus, some games at bowl sites, like I think that ends up being a really nice scenario for everyone. Because I do think like look, like the bowl system is really important and is a really crucial sort of foundation to what college football has been for so long. And I think there's, whether it's sponsors or advertisers or whoever, like there's a lot of big business in this as well. And I think like people recognize that and people recognize the brand value of bowl games. And I think that like the more you can sort of marry the two things, I think the better.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there will be plenty more discussion to come on that front in the coming years. This is just the beginning, but because we hope to see you in our press box this postseason, especially if South Carolina makes it down. I definitely expect you then, but we'll have lots of fun Pop Tarts and cheese festivities going on, and we're excited for bowl season here, regardless if it comes down. But thank you again, Ben, for joining us this morning. It's been great catching up with you, and we'll talk to you, see you again soon.
Definitely. Thanks, Sam. Appreciate you, man.
Yep.